Welcome to Spooky Halls. On tonight's episode is a special type of episode. This is a 9-part series where you'll hear the first 2 parts here. It's titled, We Have Broken Into an Egyptian Tomb on the Hunt for Our Missing Friend, by Reddit user Darkly Gathers. We have broken into an Egyptian tomb on the hunt for our missing friend. Ancient secrets lie below, and each level hints at new horrors. Part 1. The sandstorm rages across the desert. The sun hangs low in the sky, and the world is a swirling, shadowy blur of orange and gold. The sand stings like little shards of glass where it strikes my skin. The thin cloth of my trousers, an Egyptian-styled galabia, billowing out and doing little to protect me from the fevered assault over the dunes. The leader of our expedition, Professor Deborah Winterfield, stands before us, arms crossed, back straight. I can just about see her through the slits in my fingers, eyes squinted. Beyond her and just visible through the storm is our bus, a battered old vehicle now slowly disappearing beyond the sight beneath layers of yellow dust. The driver stood to my right, a local named Sethos, the man who was able to guide the way. He looks at me through his goggles and asks, in English, if I'm alright. I lie and reply that I am. The man had only 4 spare pairs of goggles in the bus. The professor had the foresight to bring her own. There are 6 of us in total, so I volunteered to go without. I'm regretting that decision now a little. The other 3 members of the team stand to my left. An Irishman in his late 20s named Ronnie, an Egyptian-American grad student by the name of Aziza, and a middle-aged, sturdily built guy called Dave from Oxford, like the professor and myself. I'm a supposed mature student, but I think that Dave and the professor are friends. He's certainly not a teacher. He's a miserable git, to be honest. He's been nothing but rude and cold since I met him in Cairo airport the other day. I have no idea what his problem is. 1 year ago, the professor's voice suddenly blares, strong and fierce above the gale. 1 year ago, my friend and colleague, Rocco Cain, as you know, abruptly vanished off the face of the planet. Over the course of these last 12 months, I have come to the understanding that Rocco, at some point, discovered the entrance to a particular tomb. The tomb of the object of his life's work, the forgotten pharaoh, Osiris. And not only this, but more importantly, a way inside. Why Rocco chose not to share with me his discovery, why he would disappear without a trace, I do not know. But disappear he did, and he never returned. I have spent the last year of my life following the paper trail Rocco left behind, and now I believe that we stand at the entrance of Osiris' tomb. The party glanced over to our right. There is no gate nor hole in the ground, nor visible entrance of any kind. There stands instead a lone and cracked pillar, an ancient obelisk, and carved down in it is a long and winding snake, a cobra with 6 segments. The 3rd and 6th have been depicted embedded with knives. Pharaoh Osiris was, as the legend suggests, a wise and benevolent ruler of Egypt, a man who was jealously slain from the throne by his younger brother, Karo, the usurper, a lunatic obsessed with the occult. This is my understanding, at least. None know more about the pharaoh and his struggle than Rocco, and his research papers sit largely unpublished, gathering dust on his abandoned desk. The professor is a hard woman, but I feel like in this sentence I can hear a flash of emotion glinting off the edge of her voice. I know that the 2 were close. Rocco was a teacher of mine for a brief period, and it was through him that I met Professor Winterfield, a fascinating woman, late 50s, with short, white hair but young and shining eyes, tall for a woman, with a strong, sinewy muscle covered in ruined tattoos, sacred symbols of people gone by, Native American, Celtic, Chinese, and even Mesopotamian. I wonder idly if her obsession with the occult is anything like the supposed usurper Karo was. You have all, for your own reasons, chosen to accompany me on this mission, the professor continues. and for that I am grateful, truly, and my respect for your willingness to venture out unto the unknown is unparalleled. But I will not think less of you if you now choose to turn back. And I warn you, we are approaching your final chance to do so. If my assessment of Rocco's notes are correct, then the tomb will have 6 layers, and we will not stop nor halt the expedition, nor make to turn back until we have successfully found and rescued Rocco Kahin, enduring to reach the 6th and lowermost level if necessary. And no, before you ask, I cannot guarantee you that Rocco is down there at all. This is simply my best and most educated guess. The sand in the sky is whipped and strewn malevolently across the desert. I cup my hands and a little tighter around my eyes. The professor is giving us a lot to process at once. Rocco was always under the impression that the tomb of Omosares would be home to a terrible curse, one formed from a bitter chaos of the betrayal that the pharaoh endured. The betrayal he felt at being murdered by his own brother. A single page of a worn and weird journal from the 1800s that I discovered buried in Rocco's desk corroborates this. The curse is said to twist and blur the walls of reality, to distort our understandings of the possible with each and every subsequent layer down. And they say that those who do indeed venture down are changed. The professor clears her throat. This will be an expedition the likes of which none of you will have ever been on before, and you may never see its kind again for as long as you live. The discoveries we make and the things we may see forever change your perception of the world. And we have, I believe, a real chance of finding and perhaps saving the life of a good man. If you would like to leave, however, I will not begrudge you for even a second, and you should now return to the bus. The dunes in the distance flicker in and out of sight through the shifting, swirling sand. The silhouette of the bus shimmers in the redding light of the setting sun. But nobody moves, not even the driver to my right. The professor nods, or at least I think she does. It's difficult to tell. Very well, she says, and she draws an amulet of fine gold, one in the shape of a scarab beetle, from behind her shirt. It's hooked on a chain around her neck, and she allows it to drop down over her chest. She moves from her position, walking past us towards the obelisk, then stands there in silence for a minute or two as we watch with growing anticipation. The red light of the sun strikes the eyes of the carved cobra, and the professor steps forward, pulling away the straps and bandages around her hands, the ones protecting her skin. She rubs her fingers over the sand and dust and stone in the pillar, then turns to us. Watch me very carefully, she calls over the rush of the storm, and do exactly as I do. Once inside, I shall wait for 15 minutes and no more before pressing on. If you have not joined me by that time, I shall assume you have changed your mind. She raises her fingers to her mouth and begins to rub the dust from the obelisk into her gums. There is a stirring among the group. I see Ronnie and Aziza exchange a look. Dave remains as stone-faced as ever and watches dispassionately, arms folded. The scar on the back of the professor's hand becomes visible for a quick second. Clear and through a lull in the raging sands is a deep and unsightly mark, a rough R shape, comprised of a series of straight lines. I asked her about it once, and she told me that it was an old and powerful runic symbol of immense significance, used by an ancient Norseman, the Celtics, and the first Anglo-Saxons, among others. It relates to journey or to travel between. That's all the information I could get out of her, as she refused to tell me any more. I'm under the impression that the professor carved the symbol into her hand herself. For what purpose, however, I cannot say. She finishes rubbing the sand into her upper and lower gums, then lightly presses her lips against the golden amulet around her neck. Finally, she pulls off her goggles and lifts up her handkerchief from her neck to cover her eyes, an effective blindfold. A murmur of unease creeps around the group as the amulet begins to glow in a faint red. Or is it just a reflection from the setting sun? I can't be sure, but the amulet seems too bright, Proportionately, it glows with too fierce a shade, and the professor turns and walks towards the pillar. She does not slow. She keeps her arms close to her sides, and without another word, she walks right through it and disappears. She leaves behind the chain, which hangs against the side of the pillar for a quick second, before dropping and collapsing down to its base in the sand. It takes a moment for me to process what I'd just seen. For all of us. Then the group erupts into disarray. Ronnie in particular starts babbling incoherently. He looks at me through his goggles, gesturing to his eyes. "Did you see that, Leela?" he asks in a strong Irish lilt. "Did you fucking see that?" I reply in the affirmation, and he and the driver Sethos scramble right up to the pillar, examining it and looking all around it, running their hands over the carvings of the snake. But it's solid rock. It's plain to see even through the sandstorm. Aziza has her hands over her mouth, shaking her head, but Dave simply stares at the pillar. I can just about make out his eyes through the goggles, and they are wide in disbelief, but he says nothing. He shoots me a look, then pulls down his scarf to reveal the grim, set and stubbled jaw beneath. He strides to the pillar and squats to pick up the amulet, placing it over his head, then collects the sand and dust on his fingers, rubbing the mixture into his gums with a grimace as the professor had done. The others have stopped to watch him. He draws the amulet up to his mouth, lightly kisses the scarab beetle, then blindfolds himself. We observed in silent fascination as he squares his shoulders and cracks his knuckles, steadying his will, perhaps. Then he sets off, boldly walking forward towards the opulus. He keeps pace, and just as he looks set to crash right into it, he strides instead of straight through, vanishing into the rock. "Good Christ," Ronnie mutters. The driver taps his forehead and murmurs something in Arabic. "Impossible." But we all saw it. They had both disappeared. The eyes of the stone snake sparkle in red as the sun begins to sink behind the dunes in the distance. "I'm going next," Aziza calls out, rushing forward to grab the amulet, once again left behind at the pillar's base. I met Ronnie's eyes, and we both looked back to the bus at the same time. This has all of a sudden become brutally and terrifyingly real. We have no idea what might lie beneath the ground in Pharaoh Amizoar's supposed tomb. My heart beats hot and fast in my chest, and the bus calls. But I cannot answer, and neither can Ronnie. I can tell from his body language. He can no more resist the pull of the unknown than I. It is the stronger force. That's why we're all here in the desert, beyond the edges of civilization, in the pursuit of knowledge. That's why I'm here, at least. That and the fact that the professor enthralls me like no one else. Where she goes, excitement follows. A little fear is a small price to pay for such wonders. Aziza completes the ritual, but she wavers right before the pillar and crashes into it with a cry. She stumbles to the floor and tears off her blindfold, shielding her eyes from the blowing sand as she swears in frustration. The driver shakes his head and gently takes the amulet from around her neck. "You have to have faith in the obulus will allow you to pass," he says before rubbing the pillar's sand into his gums. Then he too kisses the amulet, covers his eyes, and steps through the rock as if it were a shimmering veil. "Go on, girl," Ronnie encourages her. "You've got this." She tries again, and this time is successful, vanishing into the pillar. Ronnie turns to me. "Ladies first," he says, but I politely decline. "No," I reply. "I think I would like to be last." "You're not thinking of doing a runner now, are you?" he asked me. No, I couldn't. I couldn't just walk away from seeing something like that. But I need another minute." He shrugs. "Suit yourself, but don't take too long about it." He gestures to the setting sun. Before stepping up to the pillar to collect the fallen amulet, he takes a deep breath and strolls through into the beyond. And then it's just me. I stare at the pillar, and the snake stares back, eyes aglow. What would happen if I just stopped walking once I hit the pillar? Would I be cut in two? Would I forever be stuck, half embedded into the rock? I push these thoughts from my mind. That's the wrong approach, I tell myself. The pillar is not solid. It can't be, or else it would not have allowed my team to pass through it. I will not get stuck in the pillar because the pillar will allow me through. The pillar will allow me through. I lift the amulet in a shaking hand as the light of the sun sparkles like fire in the cobra's eyes. It'll be gone behind the dunes in another moment. It's now or never. So I rub the sand into my gums. It's repulsive, and I can feel the grains become at once stuck in my teeth, but I suffer through it, trying not to swallow any of the sand in the process, and kiss the amulet slightly on the scarab's golden back. Then I turn to face the pillar, taking one last look before bringing my scarf up over my eyes. I calm my nerves, frantic as they are, as best as I can, and I march forwards, blindly towards the obelisk. It will let me pass. The pillar will let me too pass. I do not brace for impact. I do not slow my step. And suddenly the orange-red glare through the blindfold disappears in favor of a cool, darker, more colorless shade. The barrage of sand against my skin ceases at once, though the stings persist. The air remains thick, but as with the level of light, it too cools around me, and the voices of my companions become audible. There she is. I told you she was coming. I stop, my legs trembling despite the will I'm exerting upon them, and I tear off the scarf turned blindfold, spitting the sand from my mouth onto the ground. The amulet, I realize, is no longer around my neck, and I stand in an enormous cavern, a long and stony hall flanked by giant watchful statues, robed tunic-clad men with the heads of animals and birds. I bring a hand up to my mouth as I stare around in shock and wonder. My pulse races. Never before have I felt so small, so suddenly minute and insignificant, ant-like in a world of towering colossal. It's magnificent, isn't it? The professor asked from beside me. I can only nod at first. It's like nothing I've ever seen, I eventually replied. This whole place, it's incredible. Aziza is squealing like a schoolgirl. I watch as she bounces and flickers her long dark hair from her face, running from statue to statue, scraping off the subtlest of samples, which she promptly bags and pushes into her backpack. A row of branch-like torches adorn the walls between the great statues, accompanied by the occasional pot of what looks like oil. For now, however, we are utilizing the more modern light from the electric torches we brought with us. I draw mine from my belt and click it on, shining the beam over the walls. Miss Leela, Sethos calls to me from nearby. I head over to him and he gestures to a section of wall. You mentioned the subject of your thesis on the drive over. This may be of interest to you. We both light up the wall with our beams. Amazing, I reply. To be honest though, Sethos, even if I was studying English or math or politics, this would be one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. He nods agreeingly. I've lived in Egypt all my life, but I've never seen anything like this. This place, I will always be grateful to Professor Winterfield. She has given me an opportunity that no one else could. A chance to experience true Heka, the magic of the Ancient Ones. The scene on the walls is a series of intricately, carefully carved engravings. A detailed picture or collection of pictures in the stone. They tell a story. The first picture shows us a woman, an ancient Egyptian woman, I presumed, huddled over a man collapsed on the ground. The woman is scarred across her face, and she looks scared. The second picture besides it shows the man, at least I think it's the same man, it's hard to tell, standing on a podium and speaking to a large gathering. The woman is the same though. I can tell by the depicted scar. She stands just behind him, watching him address the crowds. My eyes wander down through the carvings. There is one of the man and the woman exploring what appears to be a cave. There's one of them together in a boat. They look happy in that one, though it's difficult to discern emotion to be fair. The final picture shows a woman alone, standing over a sarcophagus. Her eyes are closed, but she appears to be smiling. A shiver of frisson rushes through me, and whilst I do not know the meaning behind the engravings, if indeed there is any, they make an impact on me nonetheless. Come on, echoes the voice of the professor. We should be moving on along our way. Reluctantly, Sethos and I pull away from the wall to fall into step with the team. Aziza whines with frustration until a measured glance from the professor reminds her that we are, of course, here, primarily to find and rescue her friend and colleague, esteemed academic Rocco Kayan. Could he really be down here? I think to myself as our footsteps reverberate through the vast and stony hall, the statues watching from above as we slowly pass them by. He's been gone for a year. A year! And as much as I'd love to find him, what chances do we have? If he even came down here at all, what could we find other than his corpse? Does the professor know something we don't? Dave reaches into his pocket and pulls out an iPhone, connecting the headphones and pushing the buds into his ear. Listening to anything fun? I asked him. Fuck off, he replies. Mind your own business. Every time I try to make an effort, he pushes me away. Prick. Moronic thing to do anyway. I'd much rather have my ears free to listen, though there's not much to listen for at present. The professor brings us to an eventual stop. The hall and the statues carry him further into the distance, becoming lost under the blue-gray shadows. But we have reached an anomaly, a break in the repetition. Below us in the ground are 6 dark and narrow holes, roundish in shape, and a faint, almost imperceptible whistling echoes up from beneath. Realization lights up the faces of the team, one by one, as they understand what needs to happen next. I am one of the last, but when I realize, my stomach lurches in distress and a wave of cold panic rises up to my head. No, I muttered, looking at these holes in the rock, these dark and dangerous passages to the unknown. Professor, you can't be serious. There's no way. You don't mean for us to... This is the way down, the professor says solemnly, her eyes glittering in the gloom. Down to the lair below. They are mentioned in the extract from 1891. Though, of course, I could not be certain to what the author referred without context such as this. Dave has gone pale. Aziza seems to have only just clicked onto what we were talking about. Ronnie speaks, waving his hands. I'm not fucking going down there, Professor. Not a chance in hell. It's too narrow. I'll get stuck. The thought of becoming stuck, of getting trapped in that vertical little tunnel, squeezed painfully and unable to move alone in the dark. I hear the sound of rapid breathing in and out, and I realize that it is mine. I'm afraid that you have little choice, the professor replies, wandering off into the shadows of this endless hall, if you wish. And it may well be endless, or follow me down to the next level. The thought of becoming separated from the professor in this strange and alien place fills me with dread. But these holes, God, could I do it? Could I really go down? The professor walks across the breadth of the hall and lashes a knotted rope to the base of one of the statues. She drops the other end down the closest hole, before winking at us and dropping down into it herself. We gasp in alarm, but she does not go far. Peering over the side, her head and shoulders are still visible, and she looks up at us as she squirms and wiggles, slowly descending down into the dark. I'll see you below, she calls out as she fades into the darkness. And as she disappears from view, the hall begins to rumble. I can feel it, we all do. Frantically, our beams are cast around. Dust falls in little streams from the ceiling, and I make the mistake of looking up, shining my light up into one of the statue's faces. Being so far from us, his face is only barely illuminated, but he is clear enough, quite clear indeed. A man with a spear and the head of a baboon is turned to look directly down at me. At that exact position in which I now stood, my eyes met his, large and stone as they are. None of the other statues were facing any direction but straight forwards. I could have sworn it. The ground shakes, and the deep and ethereal humming rises in the shadows. Panic jumps from person to person like electricity, and we draw together unconsciously, beams quivering. I'm going down, says Sethos quietly as he crouches, then slips his legs over the edge of a hole. He taps his forehead, mutters in Arabic, and pushes himself in. Even watching this process is enough to make my skin crawl. But down he goes, shimmering himself around, fists and arms pressed up against his chest as he descends. Go, says Dave finally and loudly. It makes me jump. All of you, get the fuck in. Dave, Aziza murmurs, whimpering. Dave, I don't think I can. I'm going to get stuck. "You're the skinniest one here," Dave replies. "Now get in." We follow the professor down. We agreed. Turn your back on her at your own risk. A chanting in a language I do not recognize begins to flow through the walls with the rumblings. The dust falls. "Now!" Dave shouts, and rather than argue, the others do as he says. They move towards the holes and grimace as they start to slide themselves down. I sit perched on the edge, my mind disconnected from my body. It feels like I'm looking down on myself from above. Am I going to do this? Am I really going to do this? "Leela," Dave says quietly, and I realize that it could well be the first time he's addressed me by my name. In shaking hands, I lower the thin rope tied to my backpack as far as I am able down the hole, then let it drop. I do not hear it hit solid ground, but I follow, trying to keep the reins on my panic. I drop down into the hole, quickly becoming lodged, and I have to shake and rustle in order to descend. The light from above is soon lost, and the rock close to my face rises up. The sound of my breathing is amplified until it becomes the only noise to accompany the rush of blood in my ears. All around me is darkness, and down I go, down to the level below. Part 2. We have broken into an Egyptian tomb on the hunt for our missing friend. Ancient secrets lie below, and each level hints at new horrors. The second level. The tunnel is like nothing I've experienced. It's so painfully tight, I grunt with effort, sweat budding on my forehead as I twist and turn, lowering myself mere inches at a time, tortuously, reluctantly down through the darkness. My arm, caught by my side, becomes bent at an unnatural angle, and the rush of pins and needles floods relentlessly through my joints. Normally, I would just wince and stretch the discomfort away. But in here, trapped in the hole, I cannot move it. It is stuck, and so the discomfort only grows into outright pain. "Fuck!" I cry out, struggling to shift myself, to get myself free. I drop down successfully, another few inches, but my arm remains fixed in place. Pitful sobs escape my lungs, and the rock of the tunnel is so close to my face that I can feel the heat from my breath wash back over me. Don't think about it, just keep moving. That's what I keep telling myself. If I allow myself to think, I will panic. Panic will be the end of me. Keep moving. Don't get stuck. Don't get stuck. The sweat crosses my forehead, buds in thicker beads. It begins to trickle down into my eyes, and of course I cannot wipe it away. It stings. I blink rapidly instead though. Unfortunately, it barely helps. It does give me an idea though. I start to deliberately exert myself. I shift and shake as best as I can, using energy, and I feel the sweat forming on my exposed legs, my bare arms. It acts as a lubricant, for lack of a better word, and I find I am able to shuffle down through the tunnel with slightly greater ease, my feet connecting occasionally with rocks, then with nothing, then again with rock, and then with nothing. Down I go. Down, down, down. Shifting, squirming, breathing. Inch by agonizing inch. Occasionally, I become lodged in place. The control I have over my disposition wavers. The fear flares up, and it takes everything I have to push it back down and continue my descent. After what feels like hours, but surely could have been no longer than 15 minutes, my heart leaps with relief. My lower legs have some space beneath my knees. I find that I can wave them about freely. I can kick them forwards and backwards, and they connect with nothing. No rock, just open, welcome air. I'm nearly there. I'm nearly there. I shake my shoulders from left to right, and I drop with boosted speed until I am falling. The darkness is replaced with a wonderful glow of orange, and I drop down through the air, gasping. I briefly meet the eyes of the professor and crash to the floor, stumbling, crashing down onto my side. I groan, but despite this sudden burst of pain, I can only grin. To be free of such hell, I let out a laugh. For the soul's sake. The professor reaches out a hand and helps me up. The knotted rope hangs from the hole in the ceiling behind her, and a pair of kicking legs dangle from another. Ronnie's, I believe. Aziza and Sethos are down here already. Aziza hugs me.
"That was the worst thing I've done in my life,"
she mutters giddily. I can feel her heart beat fast against my chest. Sethos and the professor reach up to grab a hold of Ronnie's leg, pulling him clumsily down into the cavern as I stretch my arms, wincing and encouraging the blood flow to properly return. I take a good look at my surroundings. The ceiling is a lot lower in this lair. No more than 3 meters, probably more like 2.5. Beneath the hole with the rope and against the wall is a curious candle-like torch, which the professor has presumably lightened. It shifts and stirs with a gentle yellow-orange flame, and a stream of thin and pale smoke rises wavering up back through the hole. It smells pleasant, and the fire casts its flickering glow out and over the walls, and the walls themselves. At first, I think it is only a trick of the light, a distortion caused by the shimmering shadows, but I step up close and place my hand on the stone, and I realize that what I am seeing is no illusion. The walls are moving. Ever so lightly. Almost imperceivable, but it is shifting. Low and gentle, rolling waves ease their way along the rock, alternatingly bulging and retracting the hieroglyphs down and carved into its surface. "Professor," I murmured, "have you seen this? The walls, they move."
"Yes,"
she replies, stepping up next to me, placing a hand covered in tattoo symbols against its surface.
"Quite curious."
"Quite curious," I repeat, staring at her. "It's a little more than that, don't you think? Does the journal page mention anything about this? What about Rocco's notes?"
"Rocco's notes have taken to be no more than guesses. He did not mention anything about the tunnels in the ground, nor about these shifting walls, nor indeed anything particular about any of the layers. And regarding the journal, I get the impression that the author never actually ventured into the tomb himself. His words are a second-hand account. Here, take a look."
She reaches into her bag and pulls out a copy of the page, annotated with her own notes in red around the margin. The original script is written in scrawling cursive and is difficult to make out, but it reads as follows. "Of Cairo have struck me rather deep. A lunatic, one would assume, but his story is one of such fascination that I cannot display it from my mind. None of the chaps can understand a word the man says, of course, but curiously neither can our translators, nor any of the locals we were able to take him to. It took a tremendous effort to drag the fellow away from the pillar, and for the longest time he would push us away as he obsessed deliriously over the obelisk. Were it not for the frankly remarkable state we found him in, I should think we would have simply left him in the desert and carried on along our way. When we finally had the chap settled at base camp, we were able to encourage out of him some drawings, the simplest of things, you should understand, but we had quite the time of trying to work them out. An Aryan beetle of some kind, hooked on a chain. That one was quite clear enough, but the others, 6 circles marked with arrows and steps, a long, low table adorned with bones, a frightening beast with a crocodile head, and 6 lines, 6 horizontal lines, over and over again, with a figure sat hunched on the lowermost. This was his favorite. He drew this great many times, and quickly fell into distress. By morning, he had vanished. I dare say he returned to the pillar, and were it not for our schedule, I should very much have liked to return to him. M. Kiro. And there, the entry cuts off. I don't really know what to make of it, to be honest. A frustrating piece of literature. One that raises more questions than answers. The date in the upper right reads 15th June of 1891. The author writes about a man, a lunatic. Who do you think he was, Professor?
An Egyptian man, perhaps. One who had somehow discovered a way inside the tomb. Though, while no one was able to understand him, I cannot say, nor do I have an explanation for the mentions of Amakiro, the pharaoh's brother and murderer. To my knowledge, the story Omisares and Amakiro was uncovered by our very own Rocco Can. For these people from 1891 to have been familiar with the name Amakiro, they must have known something we don't, something that has since become long forgotten.
The professor shakes her head as the light of the flickering flame reflects off of the weather-worn yet noble features.
Riddles within riddles, but answers lie beneath, Leela. I can feel it.
I gesture to the slowly shifting walls and the pattern upon them. Can you read any of these, Professor? The hieroglyphs, I mean? The professor grimaces and rubs her jaw, casting her eyes over the walls and down the passage into the darkness. I shoot a glance over my shoulder to see Dave slipping from the hole in the ceiling and landing awkwardly on his backpack on the ground with a grunt.
A little,
she replies.
But it is a difficult language to read without a period or long and careful study. The pictograms represent not only sounds, but can also refer to the exact image depicted, or even as a symbol or a metaphor for something else. And this is all possible within the frame of a single sentence. Here, for instance, I can, for long periods of research, recognize the names Amasarius and Amakero. These pictures have represented the sounds of the consonants in their names, and the symbols at the end. The Ankh refers to life. The oval carved around the letters tells the reader that the names belong to the pharaohs.
Sethos has come up alongside us. He snaps a picture with a digital camera, the flash blinding us temporarily.
My niece will be enthralled by the tales of this world,
he says with awe.
Never have I felt so close to my ancestors, and who else has? The ancients who walked upon this ground?
Ronnie comes up on the other side, his red hair all the brighter in the orange glow. What about this one, Professor? Or these ones, I should say. The repeating line. He taps a series of hieroglyphs, carved much larger than the rest, and it only takes a quick look down the walls to see that they appear again and again, over and over. The professor studies them closely.
The first is fire, easy to tell, as the accompanying glimpse spell the letters for flame. The third relates to earth, or more accurately, to stone. The fourth is water. The three ripples, and thus I would presume that the cell, the second picture in the row, relates in this case to wind, or a gust of air.
Fire, air, stone, water, Ronnie murmurs. We dwell on this for a moment, then continue along our way, leaving the light of the wall torches flame behind us. We draw out our own torches once again, clicking them on and scanning the beams down the passageway. It's much more claustrophobic in this lair than it was on the lair above, though I shouldn't complain. Compared to the tightness of the tunnels, it is far, far more than spacious enough. It's exhilarating actually, the whole thing, not knowing what may lead ahead in the darkness. Terrifying, but exhilarating. We're all adrenaline junkies here, to an extent. We must be. No one in their right mind would volunteer for a mission such as this. I wonder what must have been going through Rocco's head for him to come to such a place all alone, and without breathing to anyone a word of his plans. My thoughts and fears are interrupted by the frustration as Dave knocks into me from the side. Or perhaps I knocked into him. I can't be sure. "Watch where you're going," he mutters, not bothering to even draw out either of his headphones. "Sorry," I replied automatically before I can decide whether or not I actually want to apologize. I curse myself and drop to the back of the group with Ronnie and Izza. "What the hell is his problem anyway?" I whisper to them. Izza shrugs.
He's barely spoken a word to me since the airport. Shame. He's kind of hot, too. He's got that whole silent, mysterious vibe going.
She bites her lip and I roll my eyes. "He's way too old for you, Izza. And besides, you could do better. Ronnie? Exactly, Ronnie winks, leaning close to us and raising an eyebrow in an exaggerated display of mock charm. Is a mon petit fellow. I am the man for you. Asa giggles. No, Ronnie, I replied, exasperated. That's not what. I'm asking you if you know why Dave is such a dick. What's his deal, do you know? Ronnie chuckles, his shadow cast long over the shifting stony walls. No, afraid not. But I'm pretty sure the professor basically saved his life once, and a long time ago, and I reckon that this is his way of repaying the debt. Interesting, I muttered, looking down the corridor and ahead to the front of the group. The professor chats quietly with Sethos to her left, and Dave is just behind to the right. He walks stooped, his pistol rattling softly at the side of his belt in his holster. His hands go to it suddenly as a blast of wind rushes down the tunnel towards us. The air is hot and fast, and I shield my eyes as sand is whipped up from the ground and around us.
Brace against the walls!
The professor calls out over her shoulder, and we do so as the wind whips wildly past. I turn my head to face back to the way we came, and far down in the distance I can see the flame of the burning torch get blown out, and the area beneath the holes in the ceiling is plunged into darkness. The gust lasts for no more than a minute, but we're all a little shaken once it has passed. The fuck was that? Ronnie murmurs, but no one answers.
A warning, I should think.
The professor mutters after a while.
After all, we are trespassing on a tomb here. Keep your wits about you.
And she marches down the tunnel. Uneasily, we follow. The unease completes its metamorphosis into fear upon the sight of the statues through the dark. My torch beam catches on the first, and I initially mistake it for another person, waiting for us down the corridor. I shriek in alarm and jump back, but a flush of embarrassment has me apologizing, and I clear my throat. The statue is unique upon closer inspection. It is of a man, and not of an Egyptian, not an ancient one, at the least. He is decently modern looking. It's around my height, and wears what appears to be a particularly carved button shirt. His trousers have pockets. His shoes are not dissimilar to the boots worn by Sethos, which he comments upon. Fascinating, someone says as Dave taps the statue's head. A small cloud of dust is disturbed, and the grains trickle down the statue's face. Sethos snaps a picture. Further down the tunnel are two more statues, a woman with her eyes closed and arms folded, her expression one of deep concern, and a man with his hand on his chest, staring out through the stony eyes into nothingness. Holy hell, Ronnie says. Look at this guy. He's wearing glasses. Sure enough, a pair of stone-framed spectacles have been carved into the statue's head. Glassless, though, of course. He looks panicked, and I cannot help but feel deeply disturbed by the sight of these statues. They are not ancient. They cannot be. That wouldn't make sense. And their style is completely different to the titans that we saw in the lair above. This is not ancient Egyptian stonework. So what is it? Professor? Aziza asks, but the professor does not reply. She looks from the statues to the wall, to the repeating pattern of the hieroglyphs.
Fire, stone, air, water. There are more statues a little ways ahead,
she says.
Let's go take a look.
And there are 4 of them, stood around a wide slab of gold, embedded into the rock floor, shining and reflecting the beams of our torches and wavings of light. 2 of the statues are holding hands. One of them, I don't fail to notice, is wearing a watch. And around the statues' bases are skeletons. 2 of these are clear, the bones lay connected in the shape of human bodies. The rest are strewn about the corridor from wall to wall, skulls, ribs, and other such bones in complete disarray. Jesus, says Ronnie. Something's nasty happened here. I'd never seen a human skeleton before. It's unnerving. Imagine them once a part of a living, breathing individual, and now just scattered debris. The professor pushes aside a skull with her foot and taps her boot against the large golden plate in the ground.
This must be the door down. Look, near the side, the 4 symbols of the elements, and they are all on the wall.
Dave pulls a headphone out of his ear and stares at the symbols, then at the statues. Fire, air, stone, he mutters. Water, Aziza and myself finish in unison. And as if on cue, the cracks in the corridor walls begin to leak. Water, cold and clear, starts to stream down through the rock. Professor, Ronnie says, his voice waving as he lifts up one of his feet. The water pools on the ground, forming rapidly connecting puddles. There is a rumble from behind the shifting walls, and the trickles of water become jet streams blasting out all around, soaking us in its rumbles and growls behind the wall. Growls which quickly rise into a roar. Professor! Panic sets in a matter of seconds. The water has risen above our heels and shows no sign of stopping. Aziza breaks from the group and makes to sprint back along the tunnel, but the professor calls her back.
We'll never make it, Azizel! It's too far!
The girl pauses in desperate deliberation as the water rises. What about the holes, though, Professor? I asked loudly above the rush of the water, my heart a hammering in my chest. If we made it, could we float into the holes and risk being stuck? Ronnie asked. I barely made it down, Leela, let alone back up. Sethos is pacing forwards and backwards. The professor stares at the golden plate, shimmering beneath the water as it rises past our knees. Dave has disconnected his headphone from his ear and is hastily stowing away his phone into a plastic bag. Hika! Sethos mutters, then turns to the professor and grabs her shoulders. Hika! Professor, the glyphs of the elements. There is a power within the script, the magic of the ancients. You know it is as well as I. Can you read them? Can you read them out loud? The professor turns to study the wall. She looks at the smaller glyphs beneath those that represent the elements, and we realize it all at about the same time, that they too are copied, repeated again and again across the walls. I push through the rising water to stand beside her. Can you understand them? She chews her tongue as the others argue among themselves.
A little. Flesh to stone. They read flesh to stone, but to speak them out loud, no one knows exactly how the glyphs are pronounced.
Could you try? Ronnie shouts, but above the rushing streams holding Aziza in his grip.
Let me go!
She screams, struggling.
I can make it! I can make it back to the holes!
The professor takes a deep breath and places her hands onto the shifting wall. She speaks in a low voice, her words ancient and deep, and two intertwining shivers of awe and dread flow through me as one. But nothing happens, however. Dave disconnects his pistol from his belt and holds it up to his head to prevent it from becoming submerged in the waters rising past our waist.
Professor!
Aziza screams, splashing.
Flesh to stone.
The professor mutters again, casting a wary glance at the statues around us. Except, of course, they may not be statues at all. Come on, Professor, I say. Try just the word for stone. The professor tries again, her hand on the wall, and she mutters a series of low syllables. Again, nothing. We're going to drown here. We're going to drown down here in the dark. But the professor tries one more time. She shouts out loud above the flow and stream of the water, the same word as before, but her pronunciation altered, and her eyes flash gold. She draws her hand away from the wall as if it struck with an electric shock, and we stare as the skin of her palm appears to bulge and warp, in time with rolls of the wall. Flesh to stone, Sethos shouts, and grabs the professor's wrist. Before we can react, he presses the professor's hand against his own forehead, and from there, his skin quickly and undeniably turns to solid stone. The sand-gray surface spreads rapidly across his face and head, then descends down his front, turning his body enclosed into rock, where he is frozen into place. The group stares. Dave pushes through the water, coming now up to his chest. Can you reverse it, Professor? Can you turn us back? The professor, bewildered as she quickly regains control.
I don't know, Dave, but my chances of returning you from stone to flesh are better. I'd wager, then, that you of reviving your drowned and bloated corpse.
Dave grimps. Then his mouth flickers into a half smile. He raises his hands. Go on then. I'd sooner be immortalized as a statue than left in a heap amongst the bones anyhow. The professor reaches forward and presses her palm against Dave's head. Like Sethos, his skin ripples and hardens onto a rock, and he is transformed into a statue before our eyes, frozen and silent. The water splashes up around us. The illusion created is that of the ceiling drawing closer and closer. Come on, Professor, get it over with, Ronnie shouts, still holding the withering Asa, and the professor promptly turns them both to stone. And then it's just the two of us, our heads and our shoulders above the water, loud and roaring.
You ready, Leela?
She asks me, and how do I even respond? Doesn't matter, anyway. Before I have time to give a voice to my thoughts, the professor has pressed her hand against my forehead, and it's cold. So much colder than the water, and the sensation of hardening skin quickly ripples down my head, and everything goes black. I am turned completely to stone. I do not need to breathe. I have no desire to. I am vaguely aware of the water rippling up past my neck, then steadily up and above my head, but I cannot hear it, nor see it. I cannot move. The pain from the fall to the cavern floor has completely and suddenly vanished. I don't feel it. I don't feel anything, in fact. I mentioned that everything goes black, but this is technically incorrect. I don't see black. I don't even see darkness. I just don't see. It is no longer one of my senses. Instead, I focus on vibrations through the ground and the pressure from above the water. I remain like this, frozen, for perhaps 4 or 5 slow minutes. At some point, I start counting in my head, counting down the minutes, and I'm eventually vaguely aware of the water receding. I am able to sense it lower, down past my shoulders, my stomach, my thighs. Silence. Stillness. And then, there is a sensation of warmth returning to the center of my forehead. It spreads over me as a welcome wave as my sight is restored. I blink and gasp, watching as the stones fall away from my body as wet dust, down into the dampened ground below. Fucking hell, I muttered, shaking, watching as the last of the water is drained away through the cracks in the ground. The professor goes through the team, returning them all to flesh, one by one. Aziza, once brought back, starts to cry. The others start thanking and congratulating the professor, stumbling over their words, most in some form of shock. And as they do so, a thought occurs to me. Professor, how were you able to turn us back? Didn't you change yourself into stone too?
No.
She replies, as she steps over to Sethos and places her hand against his head.
I almost did, I admit. But I then realized that I would not be able to speak or move, nor have the ability to reverse the incantation anyway. I found I was able to use the ability on articles of clothing, so I drew a shirt from my backpack, created an air pocket around my head, and turned that to stone instead. It worked. An uncomfortable and rather painful experience as I was dragged down to the bottom.
She gestures to a ring of pink, bruised skin around her neck.
But I was at least able to breathe and to talk, to speak the words that I am very glad to find successfully reversed the spell. So these statues, these people, I look around at the statues beside us. The panicked man, the couple holding hands. I should think that they deciphered the spell and were able to successfully turn themselves to stone. But alas, realized too late that they were not able to turn themselves back.
The professor said solemnly. Isa ceases her whimpering, and we stare in horror at the statues of the ill-fated explorers.
So, are they still in there?
She says quietly. The implication is a disturbing one. The professor steps forward and puts her hand on one of the statue's heads. The stone ripples back, quickly transforming into cracked flesh. The statue topples at once, his face frozen in form, and he is dust before he even hits the ground. Gone. There's a noise from below, and the golden plate in the floor rumbles and starts to slide open, revealing a set of carefully carved steps and descend down into the shadows beneath. The professor makes to go down, but Asa stops her.
Wait, Professor! I think you should turn everybody back. All the statues.
The professor raises an eyebrow, but she meets my eye. I nod in agreement. We don't know if they're still alive in there, Professor. You have to turn them back. There is a pause. Then,
Very well.
the professor relents, and she retreats a little back through the corridor, returning the statues to flesh one by one, and every time she does, So they collapse soundlessly into clouds of thick dust. Their time is done. And then we are off, down the steps beneath the golden plate, down to the lair below. Thank you for listening to this episode of Spooky House. If you want to hear the continuation of this story, please subscribe and make sure to hit that like button.